is the After Glass Break series, and I'm your host, David Harrison. Throughout this series, we take a candid look through the lenses of culturally diverse technology leaders to discuss their rise through the glass ceiling and what happened immediately after the glass break. Today's guest is Shajey Rumi, Vice President of Product Management at Pered. Shajey, welcome to the ride, my friend.
Hey, thank you very much. Yeah, absolutely. Pleasure to be here.
Great to have you here. Looking forward to a great show. What I like to do here is we want to make sure we can get the audience the ability to understand who Shajey is, where you come from, what things you dealt with, and then how did you get to where you are today? So with that, tell us where you grew up at, Shajey.
Yeah, that's it. So I grew up in a small town right next to the capital of Pakistan, Rawalpindi. I think, some people jokingly call it, or Royal Pindi. I think, and interestingly, Pindi means small village. So it's no longer a small village. More than 20 million people live there, but it's a substantially small in compared to some of the other cities in Pakistan. Very beautiful town. And I think the way Rawalpindi can be distinguished in comparison to some of the other towns in Pakistan is essentially that if your car breaks down in front of a gigantic castle-like house in Rawalpindi, the gentleman will come out of the house and ask you, son, you're okay. He will ask you, is everything is okay? He will probably ask, do you want a cup of tea or a cup of coffee? And once you are done with everything, you are leaving, you will suddenly realize you will basically talking with a gentleman who is a billionaire, and he perhaps has been a billionaire for generations. Now, I will not blame other cities in Pakistan. In contrast, there are cities in Pakistan, where buildings are newer, and if your car breaks down, and before that, people will basically come and talk to you, they will call the police on you, right? And that is a fundamental essence of my town and my people. People have wealth, people could be poor, but their values are more rooted in their past and their history. And sometimes that is a beauty about them, and sometimes, unfortunately, they're blocker. So grew up in Rawalpindi. Parents are originally from the northern area of Pakistan, so the mountains are in my roots. I think, every time I talk to someone, I always tell them that mountains keep on calling me, although I end up living in New Jersey, which does not have a lot of mountains, I think.
No, I'm afraid not. So as a kid growing up, were you into tech, or was it something from your parents' side of the house that brought you into the concept of being in tech?
So as a kid, I was into technology, where at that time we used to build these electronic circuits. If you remember, I think there was this a period, practical electronics and that kind of thing. I was there. And then, of course, if you really talk about the roots point of view, my dad did. He used to work for Pakistan Post Office. So he retired from there, many years of service. While he was working for Post Office, he ended up becoming interested in electronics. And he ended up taking a diploma course from Polytechnic. So every time I tell him that, Dad, I have an MBA, he always reminds me, well, your MBA of today is almost equivalent of my tech diploma of that time, right? And all humility, I absolutely 100% agreed with him. So he ended up doing that on the side. And that gave him something to do every day after his 9-to-5 job ended with Post Office. So he will come back, and then he used to work from 5 to sometimes around 10. And we even had a small radio electronics repair kind of a shop. So he used to repair radios, televisions, and sometimes I used to go and sit with him. Sometimes I ask him questions. I remember one time he asked me to solder a complete tiny radio with all the spare parts to putting it in capacitors and resistors and all these things. What I remember is I ended up creating a radio that basically picked up some channel from FM. So, and that kind of gave me an interest into electronics. But very quickly, while I was, I think my advantage of being in a formal education system, my dad studied till 10th grade in Pakistan, right? And then his diploma, if you count it, of 3 more years, of course, he thinks of it. It's equal to my MBA, but like in reality, it was like just right. And then he ended up actually. So when it comes to formal type of education, after my 10th grade, I kind of passed in front of I kind of ahead of him. And then
Right.
in 12th grade, I could read more English, more things. And in Pakistani education system, English is from the day one, so we are aware of English. And I ended up being comfortable with English, Urdu, and I think other languages. And that advantage helped me when I started looking at the radio electronics type things. Very quickly, I went from the magazines that were available in Urdu to the magazines that were available in English. And by that very fact, I became slightly ahead of my father. So I
Right.
would go back and tell him, I know, Dad, this is how you do the resistors, but if you want to use an integrated circuit, I see that's how you do it, right? And it was very interesting. And my dad, I love him for that, and I think that's how I got into circuit building, and perhaps that is the reason when after many years later, I think at one point of a time when I was actually going to pick up my master's program, I was torn between should I pick a master's in computer science program or a master of business administration, and then I
Right.
ended up meeting a mentor, and who said, I would suggest go for an MBA because that's a more experiential learning. While technology, you can learn at your own. And I think that was probably the best advice I got.
Very nice advice from a mentor. So let's take it back a little bit. I want to understand, because you said your father was a postman for most, and then he did his second business with electronics. So that means that at the time you hadn't been exposed to corporate America. Were there other people in the community that you grew up in that was a part of corporate America, and how did that happen?
Oh, so how did I? So I think this all is happening. So this part of my, this all is happening in Pakistan. So when so a little bit of kind of running through a history. So after I finished my graduate program, I did my MBA. While in MBA, I ended up doing a lot of internships with the companies. And again, I think if you kind of put together this fact that since I was very comfortable understanding and reading and comfortably navigating English and Urdu and to a little bit of Persian, I was able to really bring in the content from there. So every Sunday, there was an interesting thing used to happen on the streets of Rawalpindi. People will old books. They will just kind of bring it and leave it right at the side of the street, and you can buy old books. All New York Times bestsellers will be available. Somebody basically bought the book, and now it's available on the street. So I literally, there's none of the classics that I can tell you that I have not read it over there. I will go to the second hand, and sometimes the person selling me had no idea how valuable this thing is, right?
Right.
I mean, I remember that. I think, I read David Ogilvy's book on advertising. I read Zig Ziglar's book. I read, How to Win Friends, how to swim along the sharks, and all these kind of content was always there. And I think,
Right.
so, and that is basically, in a way, is the very first introduction to how the corporate world works. Now, that's point number one. Point number
Right.
two, after my MBA, I ended up working for a bottled water company that was later on acquired by Nestle. So we had this amazing journey of 2.5 years of really developing this business within Pakistan's capital, which is Islamabad, so which is not too far from Rawalpindi. And from a corporate culture perspective, Pakistan's corporate culture, now after 25 years of corporate America experience, I can tell you, Pakistan's corporate culture is very Americanized. People most of the time even communicate with each other in English, or what we call it like a combination of Urdu and English. Like our sentence normally has around 80% English words. And then, so once you start working in a Pakistani corporate sector, essentially what you are working on in a some kind of a global American corporate system, because I have seen we are distinctively different than the English. So in Pakistan, people are kind of like a hybrid. So I think they're like a somewhere more Americanized. So that way was my very first introduction to how the work is actually done. As a matter of fact, in my first few years when I used to come, when I came to America, I used to tell a lot of people that the excellence that I have seen in that company, Ava, a bottled water, is something that it took me many years in America to find the same excellence in terms of work and quality of work. And after so many years sitting over here, after 20 plus years, I can tell you that statement is still true. That company was amazing. The leadership had a global, I mean, if I give you the credentials of all the senior leaders, like, my boss was uh, from a bachelor's from France, experience in Societe Generale, and then she was an MBA from George Washington. My other, the MD of the company was basically a gentleman who did his financial education from England, and then he did his MBA from UCLA Anderson. So these are the kind of people you are working with, and I think in a way their attitude were very Americanized, as well as Pakistan's corporate culture is pretty Americanized, despite the fact we sometimes put a show that we are not.
That's interesting. You talk about your thirst for knowledge with books and reading as a kid growing up in Pakistan. So where did that come from? Was it your mom liked to read, your dad was a heavy reader, or is just something because it was new on the road and you want to try it and you're like, I want to learn how to do these things? Like, where did that work ethic come from, and how did that start with you as a kid?
It's very interesting. So I feel like that being the oldest sibling of my brothers and sisters, I felt like I was looking for a mentor, I think, or as my mom jokingly said that, you always looking for an older brother, right? And which I couldn't find. And in most of the cases, I feel like books and sometimes some people became those advisors and mentors for me. I remember sometimes I used to talk about books as if they were my real advisors. And it's very interesting things happen in my life. I would have a certain quest or a certain question or a certain puzzle. And in that Sunday, a book will show up, right? In that week, and in the United States, it has repeated itself. I have question, I'm looking for something, and I end up meeting somebody in the coffee shop who happens to be precisely what it is. When I told someone that person told me that there's a saying by Buddha, when a student is ready, a teacher appears. It's the paradoxical way rest of the world, right?
Yes.
For us, we think teacher is already waiting and somewhere there. No, the reality is when I'm ready as a student, the universe is ready to give you. And I think I have seen it many times manifested in my life, whether it is the books, whether it's some mentor or some random person. I just saw something interesting in somebody, and pretty awkward sometimes, and very funny stories in the beginning of the year. I will stop someone, ask them a question. They will laugh, smile, they will answer my question, and then say, how long have you been living here? 6 months ago. That makes sense why you asked the question in this way, because nobody normally stops me to ask this question. And by the way, that is the answer to that. And I think that to me was very strongly believe that if you're ready for it, the universe will give you. And I think part of that also was that my grandma always used to say that if your manners are mild, you dress nicely, and you have a tongue in your mouth, the world is your oyster, right?
Very nice saying.
Stay calm, be respectful, dress nicely, right? Because, both internal is good, but your external is good as well, because you don't want other people to judge you. And then speak nicely and ask the question, people will give it to you, universe. And I think maybe these things I have been hearing as a child, and perhaps that fundamentally made me who I am. So till in 1998, I was working for a company. 1995, I was working for this bottled water company in Pakistan. And then I ended up finding this technology opportunity with a software company that had a office in the United States, and then they had a second office in Pakistan. So they were basically looking for talent and to train them. And they were basically looking for somebody who has an experience of sales.
Right.
And they wanted to teach them somebody who understands sales business processes and understands technology. And I said, yeah, I am the person. I am, I have the love of technology. I understand it. And I had bought computer back in 1993, very first computers when they were coming there. So played with it. So by that fact, I think I was fairly comfortable with that. And then in 1998, one day my boss called me up and he said, have you ever lived away from your family before? And, I was in like my 20s, and I said, oh yeah, I lived. I'm a pretty mature person. I have lived for 22 days in my uncle's. He said, no, we're not talking about 22 days. We're talking about, have you lived longer? I said, no, I have not. He said, well, get ready. We are sending you to New York. And then I took a flight, and from Rawalpindi, I ended up going to a bigger Rawalpindi, and that was actually New York, I think.
Interesting. Let's pick up from there. That's very the road travel. It sounds like you were heavily influenced by your family. There's a spiritual presence about you that also is there as well, that kind of kept you balanced and kept you moving. But now you're moving out of the safety zone of Pakistan into the animal of the US, and especially in New York. What was that like to you, and what were some of the differences you saw now as you going into a true US culture, and now you're being introduced to that culture? What was that like for you, and what were some of the pushbacks that you saw, or some of the apprehension that you may have saw when you actually came over to the US?
So when I first came to the United States, I had it's very interesting, and I think it's so. I have 3 people in my list at that time. I wish that I could meet them in person, and you're probably going to laugh at it if I tell you. So the 3 people, and they're not all Americans. I think one of them was this Indian ghazal singer, Jagjit Singh. I wished and hoped that one day I would meet him in real life. I was so inspired by his music and his songs. And then there was I did an internship for Ogilvy and Mathers in Pakistan. So I was really, really interested if I could meet Mr. David Ogilvy, the giant. Had no idea how. I didn't know what value I will, but his books spoken to me for so many years, his words I remembered. And I thought, I'm connected. I mean, he knows it. We are friends. That's the feeling. So that's kind of naivety I carried. And in the words of some of the people that I met over here, some people jokingly said to me that you are, I think there was one person one time made a comment that, you are the youngest, what was, I think something along the line that you are the first 25-year-old kid I have ever seen in life. So because in many ways, I was a kid in that way, but then I'm in an adult body,
right,
sitting in the middle of this most amazing phenomena, New York. And so I think what saved me and what kept me was that I still didn't let go of my curiosity. And perhaps in the first 6 months was because of pure naivety, because I didn't know, what the protocol was. I landed in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, right in the melting pot of a Hasidic community on one side, the Italians on the other side, the Russians on the other side, and there was a small contingent of Pakistanis on the other side. And in my very first week, I'm walking on a street. There's this lady with an amazingly beautiful princess-like dress walking by. And I have read all these books, how in American, Tom Cruise and all these guys, they go
Right.
talk to ladies. And I'm thinking, maybe I'm going to do that. And I walk up to her and I've never done it in my life. Now I just walk up to her. And I said this first natural thing that came to me. I said, you're dressed up like a princess. And she laughed, smiled, and she said, how long you've been here in the United States? And I said, well, I just came here about 3 weeks ago. And then she smiled and she said, that's very, very kind of you. You are right. This is a very specific dress. This is how the Hasidic women who are married, they dress up. And then she smiled and laughed and she said, you didn't know that I'm married, right? I said, I had no idea. You just look beautiful. And it just kind of said that. Now, this is where the part of humanity kicks in. That lady and her husband later on tried to hook me up with a local Pakistani girls every time. Hey, we know this Pakistani family. Do you want to go and meet them? And every time he will laugh, he said, well, I still remember the first time you spoke with my wife, you didn't know the protocol, you didn't know the manners, but we realized who you were because you came across as a well-mannered, respectful, and you said what it is. And this is like a sort of a one example of many such things happen. I mean, I'm sitting in a train one day, there were a bunch of folks who were reading some book and discussing with each other. So I went to closely them. I said, what are you reading? And one of the gentlemen was sweet and kind enough. He had one book and he said, oh, we are reading this. So they were, they were the gentleman with the Jewish hats all and all this. He gave me one book. He said, here you go. You want to read it? That's for you. And of course, I tried to read it. I was like, and that was the fundamental way I approached. I walked into street asking people, so I'm here, new. If you were in my position and you wanted to redo your life, what are the things you will not do? What are the things you will do? And people ended up actually giving me advice. And then that's how basically it happened. Same way, if I ended up coming here, then after that, I had to transition from that company to another company. Again, that advice from someone who was dressed up nicely. I almost did what the Will Smith did to that gentleman, right? I walked up and I said, hey, sir, you look like you are in technology. He said, yeah, I am. I said, oh, I'm here and I need to change this company. What are my options to do that? And he said, okay, so this is my recommendation. Go in this area, go talk to these kind of companies, present yourself. And I think that's how I navigated New York. Interestingly, New York felt very welcoming, tough but welcoming, right? And every challenge was fascinating for me, trying to understand how the subways work. How like I will take a train all the way till the end. And then somebody over there told me, by the way, you know that on the same Metro Pass, you can take a bus and that can take you. So I took the bus end of Long Island, end of all of that. And I'm sitting in that and I'm wandering and I'm looking everything and I'm asking and taking note of questions, the places that connect with me, the places that don't. And that's how I basically went through the whole process. I can talk hours on it. It was fascinating for me, I think. Scary, but fascinating. Actually.
So how did that help you now that you have the concepts around the people and the environment that you're in? Help me understand how that help you in corporate America. Now you're again, you come across, you come into one of the biggest cities in the US and one of the most toughest cities in the US. You're in a really fast-paced corporate environment now in the US. All the learnings you took from your environment, your ability to try to understand how things work, how did that help you in corporate America to then start climbing? So let's just say when you got your first position as a director, like how did that help you manage the nuances of networking in the US corporate structure?
So I think when it comes to, at the core of it, I realized Americans, when you read a corporate American literature, at least a few years back, they there's an implied understanding that the human beings in America are less human and more corporate. But the reality is, you grab a lunch with any person in the world, they turn out to be the same human being as your grandma is. Like, it's just we have a slightly different way of handling. Of course, there are certain social protocols in corporate America, in comparison to Pakistan. One of the things is that in Pakistan, a lot of people believe that work is an extended family, right?
Mm.
So in America, people will say it, but very few companies in major cities, people will spend time with the colleagues over the weekend. But then I was proven wrong when I was living in Buffalo many years later, because in Buffalo, the culture was exactly the same it is in Pakistan. People, we are in the first week in the company, people will ask me, what are you guys doing over the weekend? And the next day we are invited, we are basically sitting at our colleague's house. So then I felt like there is no one single corporate America. Like there are versions to it, there are variations to it. And humanity works. So what I learned in America immediately was that be good at your work, do it effectively, do it intelligently, and then be human. If you don't know something, ask for it, and never be afraid. Like, at the end of the day, you be as humble as you can be. My grandfather used to say something which I think was a mantra for my life. He says, I am humble than the grain of the sand under your feet. And then I am more powerful than the kings of the universe, right? So Shah on one side, it's like, in Urdu, it sounds much more. So I'm a Shah on the other side, and then I'm a beggar on the other side, right? So I'm very humble. And I kept these two paradoxes with me and approached anybody. It just worked. I mean, people normally in the corporate America wanted you to deliver what you promised as a team member you can. So improve your skills, and then again, same curiosity. Ever find somebody doing something better than you? Pause your jealousy. 30 seconds. Acknowledge that you're jealous. And then ask them, hold on a minute. You did this amazing thing in the meeting. You were able to coordinate these many people. You even have some leadership and some junior members. How did you do that? What's your philosophy behind that? I have asked advice from people in circumstances where perhaps you will think it was the most awkward. Like, if somebody came, one time I was working for a company many years later, and they brought in somebody to lay off people. And the gentleman had an amazing resume. So they were basically going through this layoff process. So when my entire group's turn came, we were there, and then I basically asked the person, I said, if that's okay with you, I would love to grab a coffee with you afterwards. You don't owe me anything, but if you can. And once he was in that coffee, I asked him, what should I do better in my professional life so that I am higher up, in my skill set? And he gave me a couple of tips. I remember that still this day. And he said, if you can align yourself with company's goals and your customers' goals, you are in a much better position. And then he said, if you understand what your company's goals are, you understand what your clients' goals are, and you become expert of those goals, then you can sit in any meeting and they will listen to you, because then you will become their spiritual leader. And that exactly was the advice. I think I hopefully answer your question. I think basically,
go ahead.
It's the same core principles. You don't know it, ask for it, and be humble. I think there's one cultural concept of apprenticeship, right? And I think there was a deep-rooted belief in my mind that you need to deserve first and then demand. I think that was the contrast for me when I first time came in America. I realized that some of my colleagues would demand first, and I will basically pause. I said, hold on a minute, let's deserve first. Let's do something so that we deserve, and then we go. Once you deserve, you have an automated turbo engine, supporting you, because you've already done your due diligence. right? And now you go to them and say, I've already done that. And this aligns with company, this aligns with our customer, and this aligns with our consumer. Do you agree or not? They say, yes, I agree. Now I want this. Or if you cannot give me right now, tell me what is my path to become the next person. And I think that's how I actually did that. So humility, work hard, and then ask the question from anybody. Give me an advice. You are my Sunday weekend book. Can you help me with some advice? And they did have fun. Every person did.
I like that. My Sunday weekend book. I like that. So if you had to, one of the themes of the show is that they cannot be who they cannot see, right?
Mhm.
So if you had an advice for little Shajey that was growing up back in Pakistan, what would be the first thing you would give from advice on how to make it in corporate America? What are some of the key tenets that you need to be deployed in order to make you the ability to be a Shah on one end
Mhm.
and a pebble on the other side? What would be some of the key learnings that you would give them that would help them rise as you have risen?
I think the one advice that I will give him is, first of all, I'll tell him that everything is going to be all right, right? No matter what, keep dreaming and keep working hard. The only one thing I would ask him to make sure he changes, that his consumption is in proportion to his output, right? So read as many books as you want, but ideally produce as many books if you want. You should as well. Become part of the companies that you want to grow, but hopefully start more companies. And if you cannot start a giant company, then start a smaller one. I would give him an advice that build certain side projects that will generate $200 a month, and then put it in some account somewhere. And then at the end of a year, spend those $1,200 and $2,400 and go somewhere, right? But do it through some small independent projects. So don't be too dependent. My advice is kind of contrary to, so don't be too dependent on corporate America. Go into some kind of an entrepreneurial path. So don't just admire Elon Musk for what he has done. Be Elon Musk, I think, and that's what it is.
That is a hearty and healthy bit of information and advice. Don't admire Elon, be Elon.
Yeah, I mean, he came to United States exactly at the same time frame as I came, right? Of course, we came from slightly different mindset. He didn't have to. I think the aspect that we didn't talk about it. The point is, while all I'm going through in my life, there's an independent track of U.S. immigration you need to navigate as well.
Yeah.
And I think the constraint for most of the people like me is that you need to maintain your identity. You need to grow your inner self. Yet you need to be able to be cognizant of the fact that your immigration also has to line up. So I ended up taking that journey as well, but that is definitely a subject of another book, I think. So, but the reality is that it just adds one more constraint, right? So now you're thinking, I got in the same way. There was a gentleman who got an immigration many years later. I ended up meeting him. I asked him, one advice you can give it to me. How should I navigate the immigration world? He said, my advice is contradictory to immigration. I will tell you, don't let your inner self die just to get a green card. Because the day you're going to get a green card and if your inner self is no longer what you want it to be, you will not be happy. And I was like, okay, so essentially, I need to continuously focus on things that uniquely mine, that I can do better. I am a person who loves technology on one side, who loves business on the other side, loves to talk to customers. I need to be somewhere in this triangle because that's where I am. Then I went out and asked lawyers the opposite question. So if I am in this strong triangle, what kind of an immigration visa is appropriate for me? And then they gave me the answer to that. The alternative was to whatever visa is, you can give it to me, and then I will slave myself. Of course, I did portion of that work in my life, but whenever I was doing that work, I was aware of it. This is just one arc, and eventually I'm going to get out of here, and this is the next step. I'm going to do it. And that Shaw and Pebble kind of kept me balanced in that case.
Very nice. Yeah, it's a difficult task, especially being an immigrant to the country. That there are specific things that you would have to endure that a person that was born here won't have to endure during your struggles to make sure that you can get aligned and become a citizen or get a green card in the U.S., which makes your journey even more. What's the word I want to use? Strategic.
Right.
And your pursuits and how you were able to achieve and accomplish those pursuits by keeping that balance. I love the balance. I'm going to steal that, by the way. So I do love that balance of the Shaw and the Pebble. I love that balance and how you can maintain through those paradoxical positions in your own mental state. So Shajey, I really appreciate this. This has been absolutely a great ride. Thank you for your candid responses. And to my audience, I hope you enjoyed this. This has been great. Remember, be the Shaw and the Pebble.